The scent of polished oak and champagne hung thick in the air, a cocktail of pride and exhaustion that should have felt like triumph. I stood near the podium, my hand wrapped around a glass I had barely sipped from, the weight of the room pressing down on me like a tailored suit of size too small. This was supposed to be my night. Our night. The launch of our law firm had been the culmination of a decade of sacrifice. Long nights bent over contracts, mornings that bled into afternoons with nothing but burnt coffee to keep me upright. I could still feel the ghost of my father's watch against my wrist, though tonight I hadn't worn it. Instead, I'd chosen cologne my wife once said made me smell like victory. I had wanted everything about tonight to feel like a beginning. The room shimmered with laughter and the clinking of crystal. Colleagues, mentors, clients, we had invited them all. Faces I respected, faces I wanted to impress. And beside me, my wife, radiant in a dress that seemed stitched from midnight itself. She had always known how to command attention, how to silence a room without raising her voice. I thought her elegance reflected us, our partnership. When the time came for speeches, I stepped back, ready to let her speak. She insisted she wanted to be the one to address the crowd, to tell the story of our journey. I had agreed without hesitation. After all, no one could deny her charisma. But as she began, I felt the first chill creep down my spine. Her words were smooth at first, rehearsed, polished. She thanked the guests, spoke of ambition, of how dreams became brick and mortar, of how we built something from nothing. People nodded, smiled, raised glasses. And then, like a knife wrapped in silk, she said it. And I couldn't have done it without my trial husband. The room froze. At first, I thought I'd misheard. Trial husband? My lips parted, my brows furrowed, and I looked at her, waiting for correction, the punchline. But it never came. Her voice carried steady, almost playful, as if she just unveiled the cleverest of jokes. The laughter didn't come either. Only an uneasy shuffle rippled through the audience, like leaves caught in a sudden wind. Some guests glanced at me, others at the floor. A few smirked behind their glasses. I stood there, my chest tightening, my pulse thrumming in my ears. My trial husband, temporary, disposable, like an internship before the real job. She reached into her clutch with the poise of a magician, producing the final trick of the night. An envelope, cream-colored, thick. She held it between two manicured fingers, as though it were a gift. Then she crossed the stage, her heels clicking against the polished floor, and placed it into my hands. "Thank you for your service," she said softly, but the microphone caught it. The words echoed, amplified, and spilled into the silence like poison into water. The envelope trembled in my grip. Divorce papers. The firm we had built. The nights I had bled into this dream, the years I had bet my back to support her ambitions, all reduced to a spectacle. I couldn't speak. My throat was a fist. The lights overhead burned into me, harsher than interrogation lamps, exposing every flaw, every weakness. My reflection in the glass of a nearby window looked foreign. Cheeks hollow, eyes wide, mouth slack. People whispered. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others stared outright, hungry for drama unfolding before them. I had argued cases in front of judges who could strip a man of everything, but never had I felt as naked as I did then, holding that envelope, my wife's laughter. Yes, she laughed then, ringing like broken glass in my ears. I don't remember how I made it off the stage. My body moved without me, as if pulled by gravity, as if the floor itself wanted me gone. My chest burned. My lungs begged for air, and I pushed the crowd, their eyes cutting into me, their pity thicker than the smell of champagne. In the hallway beyond, the noise dimmed, replaced by the hollow echo of my shoes on marble. I leaned against the wall, the envelope still in my hand, fingers digging into its edges until the paper bent and creased. I wanted to tear it apart, to scream, to storm back into that room and ask her why, how, when... But my voice was gone, stolen, locked somewhere deep inside the humiliation. Instead, I slid down the wall, the cool surface against my back, the envelope clutched to my chest like a wound I couldn't staunch. That was when it hit me. Not just that she was leaving, not just that she had betrayed me, but that she had planned this. This was no accident, no slip of tongue. She wanted the humiliation public, permanent. She wanted me diminished, branded with her cruel joke. The word trial echoed in my skull, louder than the applause that had once filled my dreams. Trial husband, temporary, practice, a man to test drive before trading in. I sat there in that hallway, the muffled sound of celebration continuing behind the doors, and realized I had become a spectator in my own life. But even then, even to the fog of shame and disbelief, something stirred beneath the wreckage. Not anger, not yet. Something quieter. The seed of silence, planted deep. The knowledge that if she thought this was my ending, she had underestimated the man she had mocked. I pressed the envelope flat against my knee, staring at my trembling hands. And for the first time that night, I didn't see weakness in them. I saw potential. They say the mind softens the edges of memory, sanding down the rough parts until all that's left is a polished lie you can live with. But when I think back to how it all began, with her, the edges are still sharp. Maybe I never really let myself dull them. Maybe part of me always knew. I first saw her in the law library during our second year. Midnight. The place nearly empty, the fluorescent lights buzzing like impatient insects. She sat at a long oak table, books spread out like wings around her. I remember the way she twirled her pen absent-mindedly, the cap clicking against her teeth as she read. There was something magnetic about her focus, as if the rest of the world had been dismissed as irrelevant. I had gone there to find a quiet corner to study contracts, but instead I found her eyes lifting from the page, locking onto mine. Hazel, no, not quite hazel. A shifting color, green in some lights, amber in others like bottled storms. "You're blocking the lamp," she said. No smile, no warmth, just a statement, sharp and precise. I muttered an apology and moved aside, but instead of turning back to her book, she tilted her head, studying me as though I were a case to dissect. Then, just like that, she went back to her reading, dismissing me. And that should have been the end. But of course it wasn't. The next week, I saw her again. And the next, slowly, words replaced silence. She had a way of drawing you in, not with softness, but with challenge. Every conversation felt like a sparring match, where winning meant keeping up with her wit. I didn't notice then that the match was always on her terms. Our first real conversation lasted until dawn. We shared ambitions over vending machine coffee, her laughter echoing in the cavernous library halls. She told me she wanted to open her own firm one day, that she wouldn't settle for being anyone's associate or junior anything. I told her about my father's watch, the one he wore through decades of courtroom battles, how I wanted to honor his name, carry the same dignity he carried. She smiled, and for once it seemed genuine. "You're different," she said. "You see the world in metaphors. That's rare." That was all it took. A seed planted, watered with validation. The years that followed blurred into partnership, both academic and personal. We studied together, celebrated internships, pushed each other harder than anyone else could. She sharpened me, and I thought that meant she was good for me. Looking back, the signs were there. She met my parents once. Just once. My mother's cooking, simple and hearty, didn't impress her. She made a face, subtle enough for me to notice, but not for anyone else. Later, she said, "They're sweet, but provincial. You don't really fit here anymore, do you?" I laughed it off at the time. Told myself she was simply ambitious, misunderstood. But her words stuck like burrs in my chest. She never wanted to visit again. And slowly I visited them less. My friends weren't immune either. She'd charm them at first, then plant seeds of doubt in me afterward. "He seems threatened by you," she'd whisper. Or, "She looks at you too long." One by one, the circle around me thinned, until the only constant left was her. I mortgaged my inheritance to fund our first office, an old brick building with creaky floors and drafty windows. I told myself it was an investment in us. She told me it was proof I believed in her vision. Not our vision, hers. But I ignored that, too, because when she smiled, when she brushed her hand across my cheek after another 14-hour day, I believed I was part of something extraordinary. There were other cracks. Nights she didn't come home. claiming late meetings with potential clients, a phone that always seemed to buzz face down, perfume on her clothes that wasn't the one I bought her. The first time I asked, she laughed. "You're insecure," she said. "Don't ruin what we built with paranoia." And God help me, I believed her. Or rather, I wanted to believe her more than I wanted the truth. Because the truth would have meant that the years, the sacrifices, the distance from my family, the friendships lost, it would have all been for nothing. So I swallowed my doubts. I told myself ambition looked different on everyone, that her sharp edges were just part of the package, that when she turned away from me in bed, it was stress, not rejection. I wore the cologne she liked, even on nights when she didn't notice. I adjusted my tie to match the colors she preferred. I became the man she could display at dinners, at networking events, at fundraisers. Always smiling, always silent when she interrupted me, always grateful when she allowed me a sliver of attention. And through it all, I kept my father's watch tucked in a drawer, too afraid to scratch it, too aware that I hadn't yet earned the weight of his legacy. The day we signed a lease with a larger office, she brought champagne. "To us," she said, raising her glass. "To us." I repeated, but the words felt different on my tongue. She kissed me then, quick and cold, her eyes already scanning the documents spread out on the desk. I remember staring at the frosted glass door with our names etched side by side, hers first, always hers first. Even then, I told myself I didn't mind, because love, I thought, was about compromise, sacrifice, belief. What I didn't see, what I refused to see, was that compromise had become surrender, sacrifice had become erasure, belief had become blindness. Sometimes, late at night, when she'd fallen asleep beside me, I'd lie awake and stare at the ceiling. I'd imagine my father walking into the room, his disapproving silence heavier than any lecture. I'd imagine him asking me why I was so eager to trade my dignity for proximity to a woman who never truly let me in. I had no answer then. I still don't. What I do know is that by the time the law firm launch arrived, I had been living as half a man for years. And I didn't even realize it until she cut me down in front of everyone. The ring on my finger, the cologne on my skin, the silence in my chest, they weren't symbols of love anymore. They were shackles, and I had forged them myself. The night after the law firm launch, I sat alone in the kitchen with the envelope spread flat on the table. The house was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint tick of the wall clock. My wedding ring tapped against the paper as I held my glass, half empty, the ice long since melted. I hadn't opened the envelope. I couldn't. It sat there like a venomous thing, waiting for me to acknowledge its sting. My eyes kept drifting back to it, the words petition for divorce visible through the thin paper. Every time I looked, I felt the same knot in my chest, the same burn in my throat. The cologne I'd worn that night still clung to my shirt, faint but sharp, mocking me. Victory, she once called it. Now it smelled like failure. I replayed her words again and again, as if repetition might dull the blade. Trial husband. The phrase hollowed me out, each echo stripping away another layer of who I thought I was. The phone buzzed with messages, sympathy from colleagues, pity from friends I hadn't heard from in years. A few even tried to laugh it off, to soften the blow. Tough break, man. She's brutal. But none of them helped. Every word was salt in the wound. The days that followed blurred into humiliation. At the firm, whispers traveled faster than memos. Clients canceled meetings. Some avoided eye contact altogether, embarrassed for me. Others looked me square in the face, pity sharp in their eyes. I started noticing laughter when I walked past closed doors, though maybe that was paranoia. Maybe. I stopped wearing my ring. At first, it was absent-minded. I'd slipped it off one morning while washing my hands and forgotten to put it back on. But when I saw it lying there on the counter, small and shining, I realized I didn't miss its weight. It no longer symbolized love. It was just a circle of metal binding me to her cruelty. At night, I avoided the bedroom. I slept on the couch, the television flickering silently in the dark. The house smelled faintly of her perfume, expensive and floral, clinging to the curtains. I would have opened the windows to air it out, but it was winter, Cold crept in easily enough without me inviting it. And then came the truth. It started with a call from an associate at a rival firm, a man I'd known in law school but hadn't spoken to in years. His voice was careful, almost apologetic. "I don't know if you're aware," he said, "but she's been seeing Richard." Richard, a senior partner at one of the largest firms in the city, a man who had courted us both years ago, offering positions fresh out of law school. I had turned him down, believing in our dream, believing in her. At first, I laughed, or something that sounded like laughter. "No," I said. "She wouldn't." But he interrupted gently. "She has. Everyone knows. I thought you should, too." When the call ended, I sat in the dark, staring at the blank television screen. My reflection glared back at me, hollow-eyed, unshaven. For a long moment, I couldn't breathe. I wanted proof. I needed it. So I dug. Her laptop was easy enough. She hadn't even bothered to change the password. The emails were there, plain as daylight. Messages to Richard, half business, half intimate. Meetings booked to hotels under the guise of client dinners. And then the finances. Transfers from our joint account into an LLC I hadn't known existed. Small amounts at first, then larger. Enough to raise suspicion, but not enough to scream theft. Until I traced them back and realized she was building a cushion for herself. A cushion she intended to land on once she'd pushed me out. This wasn't betrayal born of impulse. This was architecture. She had been constructing my ruin brick by brick, while I handed her the mortar. The collapse was complete. I stopped eating. Meals went untouched, plates gathering dust in the sink. My suits hung loose on my frame. I caught my reflection in the mirror one morning and almost didn't recognize the man staring back. Gaunt cheeks, red-rimmed eyes, shoulders slumped as though gravity had finally claimed victory. I drowned nights in whiskey, the burn numbing but never silencing. The papers still sat on the table, unopened. I couldn't bring myself to sign them, but I couldn't throw them away either. They became a monument to my failure. Everywhere I went, I felt eyes on me. In the grocery store, at the gas station, even walking down the street. Pity, scorn, amusement. My humiliation had become public property. And yet, in the ruins, something flickered. It came one night when I couldn't sleep. I sat on the floor of the living room, surrounded by scattered photographs. Wedding pictures, vacations, the early days when I believed her smile. I picked one up, the two of us standing outside that first office, grinning like fools. I almost ripped it in half, but I didn't. Instead, I set it down and reached for my father's watch. I hadn't worn it in years. The leather strap was stiff, the face smudged. I held it in my palm, its weight heavier than I remembered, and I heard his voice not in words but in memory. Even the strongest case can collapse if the evidence is poisoned. That's when I understood. Her betrayal wasn't proof of my weakness. It was evidence of her rot. And evidence, properly presented, could bring down even the most powerful. For the first time in months, I felt something other than despair. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was something quieter, smaller. The faintest ember of resolve. I slipped the watch onto my wrist. It ticked steadily, indifferent to my ruin, reminded me that time moved forward whether I did or not. And I realized maybe my story wasn't over. I left the house on a Tuesday morning, not with dramatic exit, not with slammed doors or packed boxes, just a quiet gathering of essentials into a duffel bag, a few shirts, a pair of jeans, my father's watch, and the divorce envelope I still hadn't opened. The wedding ring I left behind on the bathroom counter. Its circular glint caught the morning light one last time, a reminder promises turned to ash. I didn't say goodbye to the house, but as I closed the door, the faint smell of her perfume drifted through the hall, stubborn as a ghost. I drove without destination, the highway stretching before me like a wound that wouldn't close. The silence in the car was deafening at first. No radio, no phone calls, just the hum of tires and the occasional rattle of loose change in the console. It was winter still. Bare trees clawed at the sky, and the fields on either side lay frozen, brittle under the pale sun. I rolled the window down once, letting in a slice of cold air sharp enough to sting. It felt like punishment. It felt like clarity. I ended up in a small coastal town I hadn't visited in years. The kind of place where the ocean dictated life's rhythm, where time seemed to move slower, unbothered by ambition or betrayal. I rented a modest room above a diner, the walls thin enough to hear muffled laughter below, the kind that stung at first, but later reminded me that joy still existed, even if it wasn't mine yet. Days bled into each other quietly. I walked the shoreline in the mornings, the sand cold beneath my shoes, the waves gnawing at the shore like time gnawed at memory. The sea became my confessional. Every crash of water against rock felt like it absorbed a fraction of my grief, carrying it out to deeper waters where I no longer had to hold it alone. I carried my father's watch on every walk. Its ticking grew louder in solitude, steady as a tide, a reminder that even when life shattered, time refused a pause. It was both comforting and cruel. Nights were harder. The cologne bottle I'd packed by mistake sat on the dresser, unopened. Sometimes I'd pick it up, unscrew the cap, and inhale. It was the smell of who I used to be, confident, ambitious, unbroken. Then I'd set it back down, unable to wear it, unwilling to discard it. A relic of a man I wasn't sure I could return to. Healing didn't come in sweeping gestures. It came in fragments, often in places I didn't expect. There was a waitress at the diner downstairs who noticed I always ordered black coffee, but never finished it. One morning she poured it for me without asking, and slid a plate of eggs onto the table. "On the house," she said. "You look like you need it." I wanted to argue, to insist I wasn't charity case. But instead I ate. And for the first time in weeks, I tasted food. Salt, butter, warmth. Later, she told me her husband had left her for someone younger. She laughed when she said it, but her eyes betrayed her. "You learn to live again," she said, pouring another cup. "Not because you want to, but because you don't have a choice." Her words stayed with me. Survival wasn't about willpower. It was about surrender, letting the tide carry you until you were strong enough to swim again. I started writing. At first, scraps on napkins, fragments of thoughts that gnawed at me. Then longer entries in a notebook I bought from the corner store. I wrote about the silence, about the photographs I couldn't bring myself to burn, about the courtroom metaphors that haunted me. I wrote not as a lawyer, but as a man stripped bare. And slowly, the act of writing became less about bleeding pain and more about reclaiming my voice. Each page was a small act of defiance against the silence she had left me in. One evening, I walked the pier at sunset. The horizon split between fire and ash. Couples strolled past me, holding hands, children tugging at their parents' sleeves. I should have felt bitter, but instead I felt still. The world hadn't ended, though mine had. I leaned against the railing, the salt air sharp in my lungs, and realized I hadn't thought of a law firm in days. I hadn't thought of her every waking moment. The wound was still raw, but it was no longer bleeding me dry. I checked the time on my father's watch. Its hands glowed faintly in the fading light, steady as ever. And for the first time since the humiliation, I whispered to myself, "I'm still here. Not whole, not healed, but alive." And in that realization, survival became more than endurance. It became possibility. Rebirth didn't come in a thunderclap. It came quietly, like dawn creeping across the water, pale light softening the shadows I had grown accustomed to living in. Months had passed in that coastal town. The sea and I had reached a rhythm. Its tide answered my questions with patience. Its waves swallowed my doubts when I couldn't carry them anymore. For a while, survival was enough. But then one morning, I looked at my father's watch ticking steadily against my wrist and thought, surviving isn't living. It's waiting. And I was done waiting. It started small. I rented a desk in the bookstore below my apartment, where the retired professor, Mr. Callahan, sorted through old legal texts like they were holy scripture. He noticed me scribbling in my notebook one morning and asked, "Why don't you put that sharp mind back to use?" "I don't have clients anymore," I muttered. He adjusted his glasses, peered at me with quiet amusement. "You don't need a courtroom to practice law. You need integrity. People will find you." That night, I stayed awake, staring at the ceiling. His words scratched at me. I had been telling myself I was finished, ruined, stripped of purpose. But wasn't that just another kind of prison, one I had built myself? By morning, I knew I could still fight. I could still be. I began offering free consultations online. Nothing grand, just an email address, a simple website with my name. To my surprise, people reached out. Small businesses cheated by contracts, single mothers cornered by predatory landlords, ordinary people without the money for firms like the one I had once built with her. Each case I touched reminded me of the man I used to be, not her shadow, not her trial husband, just me. My integrity became my currency, and slowly my confidence returned, not as arrogance, but as quiet certainty. The first time I wore my cologne again, it startled me. The scent rose from my skin like an old song I hadn't heard in years. For a moment, I stood in the mirror, studying the man who stared back. He looked older, thinner, but his eyes were sharper, clearer. I wasn't trying to resurrect who I had been. I was meeting someone new. But even as I rebuilt, her shadow lingered. One night, scrolling aimlessly, I stumbled on a photograph of her, online, taken at a gala with him, the rival partner. She was radiant in the spotlight, her smile sharp as polished glass. For a moment, the old ache returned, curling in my gut. But then I looked closer. Her hand clutched his arm too tightly. Her eyes didn't quite meet the camera. And in the background, two colleagues whispered, glancing at them. I recognized that look. It wasn't admiration. It was suspicion. I began digging, not out of vengeance at first, but out of instinct. Records, filings, whispers from old contacts. What I uncovered tightened into a net. Misused client funds, hidden transfers, deals inked in secrecy. She hadn't built an empire. She had stolen one. And just like that, my purpose sharpened. Every night, I spread documents across the small wooden desk in the bookstore. Bank statements, court filings, contracts. Callahan would bring tea, watch me work, and occasionally murmur, "Careful, son. Truth cuts both ways." But I was careful. I wasn't reckless, like she had accused me of being. I was deliberate, methodical, patient, the way the sea-shaped stone. My father's watch ticked beside the papers, steady as a metronome. It reminded me of cross-examinations in law school, where patience cracked even the toughest witness. She had humiliated me under a spotlight, but this would be different. I wouldn't shout. I wouldn't burn. I would let the truth do its work. One morning, I walked back to the pier where months earlier I had whispered, "I'm still here." This time, I held the wedding ring I had returned for on a whim. It was cold, smooth, weightless compared to what it once meant. I turned it over my palm, thinking of the promises, the humiliation, the ashes of man I'd once been. Then I threw it into the ocean. The arc was clean, simple, the splash small, and just like that, the tide claimed it. For the first time, I didn't feel like something had been taken from me. I felt like I had given something away, a gift to the sea, an offering for the silence it had given me. That night, I wrote in my journal. She thought I was temporary, a trial, but I was the evidence of my own existence. She cannot erase me. By autumn, the man who had staggered from that law firm opening was gone. In his place stood someone harder, steadier, no longer begging for love, no longer seeking validation. Clients began to trickle in, not just online, but in person. A farmer cheated by a supplier. A widow scammed by false insurance claims. I fought for them, won for them, and each victory stitched me back together, piece by piece. Meanwhile, the evidence against her grew. She was careless, drunk on her illusion of control. I kept my silence, biding my time, building my case in shadows. I no longer fantasized about screaming at her or begging her to see me. No, the greatest power I had now was calm. The silence between us wasn't weakness anymore. It was strategy. She had given me a trial, but I had turned it into preparation. One night, Callahan asked me, "When you face her again, what will you say?" I looked down at my father's watch, its hands glowing in the lamplight, and I smiled faintly. "Nothing," I said. "I'll let the truth speak." The man who had once been humiliated under chandeliers and champagne glasses was reborn, not in fire, but in quiet endurance, in careful preparation. And when the moment came, I would not just survive her stage. I would dismantle it. The first time I stepped back into the city, I felt the air differently. It wasn't suffocating anymore. It smelled like steel and rain, sharp and cold, but it didn't close around my throat. The streets I once staggered down in humiliation now seemed smaller, less powerful, as if they had been waiting for me to return with clearer eyes. I wore a suit I hadn't touched since that night at the law firm opening. Pressed, clean, understated. The faintest trace of cologne lingered at my collar. My father's watch ticked steadily beneath my cuff, louder in my ears in the traffic outside. I wasn't dressing for her. I was dressing for myself. Armor polished not to dazzle, but to protect. When I entered the courthouse, heads turned. Whispers fluttered like moths. Some still remembered the man humiliated under chandeliers. They were expecting to see him again, broken, trembling, drowning in shame. But he was gone. I walked past him without flinching. She sat at the defendant's table when I entered the courtroom, draped in an expensive suit, hair perfectly styled, the same dazzling smile she had used on me 1,000 times. But I saw through it now. The confidence was cracked at the edges. Her new partner, the rival who had once been her co-conspirator, wasn't beside her. Rumor had it he'd quietly distanced himself once whispers of her financial dealings spread. Betrayal, it seemed, had a habit of devouring itself. Our eyes met. For a split second, I saw recognition flicker there. The realization that the man she had once mocked as a trial husband had returned, not as prey, but as prosecutor. She looked away first. The proceedings began. I rose when it was my turn, my voice steady, almost quiet. The courtroom hushed, leaning in. I didn't grandstand. I didn't thunder. I presented facts, each piece of evidence unfolding like a blade pulled from a sheath. Bank transfers, emails, falsified signatures, misappropriated client funds. I laid out cleanly, methodically, like a surgeon exposing rot beneath the skin. Each document landed on the judge's desk like a hammer blow. With each revelation, her facade cracked further. The smile faltered, the mask slipped, and for the first time, she looked small in the room she had once commanded. I thought of that night under the chandeliers, the divorce papers trembling in my hands, and I realized this wasn't about vengeance anymore. This was about truth. The very thing she had built her power on manipulating, I now wielded against her. The divorce papers made their return. I brought them forward as an exhibit, not for legal weight, but symbolic clarity. Your Honor, I said, holding the envelope. This was delivered to me in public, at the opening of our shared law firm, not as a private matter, but as a spectacle, a performance. I laid the papers on the table between us, close enough that she had to look at them. Today, I returned them in a courtroom, not as performance, but as proof. Proof that betrayal was not just personal. It was professional. It was criminal. The silence that followed was heavier than any applause. Her lawyer stammered through objections, but it didn't matter. The evidence was airtight. When the verdict came, it wasn't dramatic. No shouts, no gasps. Just the quiet finality of justice delivered. Financial penalties, professional disgrace, potential disbarment. She stared at me across the room, eyes wild now, fury replacing charm. Her empire had crumbled not with fire, but with quiet, undeniable truth. Outside the courtroom, she caught up to me. Her heels struck the marble floor like gunshots. "You think you've won," she hissed, her voice low, trembling with rage. "You're nothing without me. You always were." I looked at her then, really looked, and for the first time I felt nothing. No anger, no longing, no grief, just emptiness where she once lived. I adjusted my cuff, the watch glinting under courthouse lights. "I was never nothing," I said softly. "You just couldn't see it." And then I walked away. The city air hit me like baptism when I stepped outside. Sunlight spilled across the courthouse steps, warm and real. I paused there, inhaling deeply. For the first time in years, the weight on my chest was gone. I thought of the ring I had thrown into the ocean, the cologne that no longer felt like a relic, the photographs that no longer haunted me, symbols of who I had been, now absorbed into who I had become. She had called me her trial husband, as if I were temporary, disposable, a placeholder for something better. But as I stood there in the sunlight, I realized the trial was never me. The trial was life with her. And I had passed, not by holding on, but by letting go. I walked down the courthouse steps slowly, not rushing, savoring each moment. The watch ticked on my wrist, steady as a tide. The city pulsed around me, horns, footsteps, laughter. Life moved on, and so did I. For the first time, the silence inside me wasn't empty. It was peace.